This email is from Judy. This is really good. She writes, I've been devouring your podcasts and videos since recently discovering you. I especially enjoy the Steve Lilly stories, and I'm anxiously awaiting the next installment. As a native Northwest Georgian, I'm also a fan of your accent, which could belong to any one of my brothers, nephews, or other kins. And I lament the loss of our regional accent, and hearing it is a balm to me. I don't think people are losing their southern accent. Maybe a little. I don't know. I just talk like I talk. Like it or not. I'm 65 years old and I grew up on a large farm in the corner of Northwest Georgia, which is within spitting distance of Chattanooga. I can see Lookout Mountain from my childhood bedroom, and I have two older brothers. One is 13 years my senior, and the next one is 7 years older than me. I was very much a tomboy as a kid, running through the woods and fields of our 300-acre farm. Our nearest neighbor was a mile away. Daddy raised beef, cattle, and pigs, and we grew tomatoes and beans for sale at the farmers' markets in Chattanooga and Atlanta. Every Sunday afternoon, we'd round up whichever cows we had pre-selected to be taken to the sale the following day. This was one of my favorite memories because it meant time in the fields and woods, and it was searching for cows and calves, and they always seemed to know that they were on the market list, and therefore they would run away. I say all this just to give you a bit of context to my Bigfoot story. Growing up in the late 60s and the early 70s, I had never heard of Bigfoot. I never heard anyone talk of any wood boogers or the likes in the area. We had deer and bobcats and the occasional black bear and an escaped hog that had gone feral, but nothing more exotic than that. I had no fear at all of anything in our expanse of pine and oak forest around the farm. Our house sat in a small clearing next to 5 cleared acres behind our house, and a few more cleared for pig pens and pig barns and cattle bars and feedlots. Just behind our house was a few acres of grazing, which was surrounded on 3 sides by piney woods. The barns were 200 yards from the house. One night in late spring of 1967, we had several hogs who were farrowing. It was always at night, it seemed, so my mom and dad and my brother were at the pig barn tending to the pigs. My older brother was already away at college. Most of the time, I'd be right in the midst of the pigs because there's nothing cuter than a newborn piglet, in my opinion. For whatever reason, on this night, I'd been left asleep in my bedroom while the others were at the pig barn. My room had one window which was fairly low to the ground, and it went nearly to the ceiling. It also had a door to the front porch which, in warm weather, I kept open along with the window to catch whatever breeze I could. Of course, we didn't have air conditioning. But on this night, I was awakened by footsteps on the porch, and I looked out through the screen door expecting to see one or more of my family coming back from the pig barns. But what I saw instead was a big shadow. It was a huge black shadow standing on the porch 5 feet or so from my screen door. It was facing me, but in the darkness I couldn't make out any features or details, just the outline of a hulking body that was so tall it had to hunch over to fit on the porch. The ceilings were 8 foot tall there. It stood there silent except for its loud, moist breathing, which reminded me of a horse after a long run. I wasn't frightened, I was just confused. What was this thing? Am I seeing it, or am I still asleep and dreaming? I could hear the squealing of pigs in the distance, so I knew I was awake. Just as I considered getting up out of bed to shut the lock on the wooden door, the shadow took a step off the porch, and I saw it pass by my open window and head around to the back of the house. Well, I jumped up and I shut and locked the door, and I pulled down the glass panes of the window. I thought about running to my parents, but what would I tell them? So I stayed in my room until they finally returned, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I never spoke to them about it because it would seem foolish in my family, which tolerated little foolishness, so I kept the whole story to myself. The following summer, or maybe the summer after that, my brother got a copy of a magazine called Field and Stream in the mail, and on the cover was a still photo of the Bigfoot from the Patterson-Gimlin film. Well, I was transfixed. There was the shadow that I had seen on my porch that spring night. This was a real thing, a true life monster, and my heart raced as I tried to put the pieces together. Could this thing live in our own piney woods? Surely not, I thought. This Bigfoot lived way out west, not here in Georgia. Over the next few weeks, I studied the dense pine forest just behind our house, which stretched for hundreds of acres. My eyes were always drawn to that tree line, wondering if I might catch a glimpse one day of what I had seen on the porch. I never heard its call, I never smelled it, never had a rock thrown at me. I wasn't afraid, I was intrigued. I wondered if it was lonely, like I was sometimes. I even wondered if it had come looking for someone or something to relieve some of that loneliness. I know that sounds crazy. Two cowboys in California had just discovered a monster in the wilderness, and I was concerned it might be lonely. Well, I never saw it again, but I did become a psychologist, maybe out of that childhood connection to helping the lonely. Or maybe not. In any case, I've always been fascinated with other people's experiences with Bigfoot, and I truly appreciate the forum that you provide for them to share their stories with the rest of us. Thank you for what you do. Well, Judy, this is just really fun for me. So, and she goes on to say, if you decide to share this, please use my first name, which I did. I just do this for fun. I think these stories are very intriguing. And this was really interesting. And it's a great story. And the story itself is it's captivating. She saw it. She was intrigued by it. It's like so many people. But I want to say she went on to become a professional, a psychologist, a person that had to earn a degree, pass all kind of tests to become licensed in what she does. And she's interested in Bigfoot. So it's not always the, Bigfoot, people who believe and follow the Bigfoot topic sometimes get cornered into this class of people that are kind of crazy. But these stories really are interesting. And they're interesting to a lot of different people, not just the crazies, although there are some crazies in this topic. Do not make any mistake about that. But I thought this was interesting that Judy is a total professional, very smart person. You have to be that way to get through those schools. This was a great story, so I really appreciate you sending it, Judy. Hey, y'all, welcome to the Dixiecryptid podcast. I appreciate you joining me. There are 6 stories of encounters with strange creatures by real people in this podcast. I don't know how long it's going to be, but it's a pretty good one. So I hope you guys enjoy it. All right, here we go. Some emails I get have a lot of personal notes to me or some preliminary background stuff that I don't normally read, but in this email, I'm going to read it from front to back because it's full of history, full of excitement, intriguing mysteries. I think you guys are really going to like this story. The writer's name is Mariana. Oh, do I have a story for you? It's a true story that happened to my grandmother in World War II. And I have a feeling you're really going to like it. The story has been around our family for a long time, but it has never been shared publicly. I took my time writing it, and right now, with all the alien stuff popping up, it seems to be a good time to finally share it. I also had one possible Bigfoot non-visual story that happened to me, but since it took place in Ohio, I sent it to Nance from Buckeye Bigfoot, and she read it on the July 15th, 2022 episode. You made a good choice. Nance does these stories a lot of justice, and she's great at this. My name is Mariana, and I live in the United States now, but I was born and raised in the beautiful town of these are some Slavic names of places, and I'm going to have trouble with it. I was raised in the beautiful town of Košice in Slovakia, the former Czechoslovakia in Central Europe. My grandmother came from a small village near a Slovak town called Pravacka Bystrica, where she grew up and lived as a young woman during the World War II. I'm looking forward to hearing you pronounce the town's names. You had once already mentioned my hometown of Koshike on your podcast a few years back when you were giving a birthday shout out. They were from there, and you did a great job pronouncing it correctly then, so I believe you'll do just fine with this one. Well, I don't remember that, but I hope I got Koshike. I think that's right. Koshike, an S with a little V on top of it I think is pronounced like a SH. On to the story. My grandmother's name was Maria, or my grandma, Marienka, as we affectionately called her. She was a sweet, good-hearted, simple Christian woman who went to church every Sunday, and she was as honest as they get. I've never, ever heard her lie or make anything up. It just wasn't in her nature. She didn't even have that kind of imagination. No one in our family ever doubted that this really happened. In fact, my dad remembers other people from her village recalling it too back when I was a kid. I was lucky to spend a lot of my time with my grandmother as a child, and she would often babysit me and my sister after school while my parents were still at work. She was truly the perfect grandma. I asked my grandparents and sister of their recollection of her retelling this story. We ended up bringing up a lot of lovely memories of her. We were all very fond of her, and decades later, I still miss her. We all do. Although we heard this story from her on different occasions, we all remember it the same. Her story never changed. And this is how I remember it. One day my parents were heading somewhere out, and Grandma came over to babysit us as usual. I may have been 9 years old at the time. My grandma and I sat in the living room trying to decide what we were going to do for fun when my father walked by and said, "Hey, why don't you ask your grandma to tell you about the time she saw an alien?" Now that got my full attention. "Tell me," I begged my grandmother. Before we get to her story, let me give you a very quick history on Czechoslovakia during the World War II, as that's when the story took place. On September 30, 1938, Adolf Hitler and the British, French, and Italian leaders signed the Munich Pact, by which they basically handed Czechoslovakia to Hitler. It was meant to keep the peace, but we all know how that turned out. After Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, he promised the Slovakia independence, and so on March 14, 1939, the first independent Slovakia was formed. This new, very small country with a weak leadership was then bullied by Germany into cooperation. It was a while before Slovakia was able to organize resistance and build up forces, and at last, on the 29th of August 1944, the Slovak national uprising broke out in response to a German invasion of Slovakia. Sadly, the Slovak national uprising was crushed by the Germans in just a couple of months. And as a retaliation for this resistance, nearly 100 villages were destroyed and thousands of people executed by the Nazis. What followed after that was several months of very difficult times under German occupation. That was before the Russian army was able to push west and liberate Slovakia toward the end of the war. It was in these turbulent times during the German occupation in the winter of 1945 that this story took place. The town of Pavaska Bystrica was little more than a village until the weapons factory was built in 1929, and that brought a lot of jobs into the area. During World War II, jobs were scarce and living was difficult, so my grandmother Maria, who was at the time 22 years old, considered herself lucky to have a job at the weapons factory. And not just any job. She held an important position of quality control of the manufactured bullets. The bullet manufacturing division was housed in a hall that workers referred to as the tunnel for its elongated shape and underground build. The long hall was filled with rows of bullet manufacturing machines which were partially automated, and when in operation they required workers to be constantly present to complete the process. Since all the able men were drafted, these jobs were left to mostly women. In fact, the whole factory employed only few men, and they were those too old or too unfit to be drafted. The only other men around were the German guards who were guarding the factory, for it was no doubt an important strategic object. Part of Maria's job at the factory, she would come down to the bullet manufacturing hall, take bullet samples for a quality check, and she would weigh them and make sure that they had the correct amount of gunpowder in them. Her visits to the hall were usually rather pleasant, as she had a lot of friends amongst the women working there, many of them from her village. However, on that November day, as she walked toward the hall entrance, she had no idea how very different this visit was going to be. At first approach, she noticed a lot of unusual commotion. The door was open and a number of women were running out screaming. Maria cautiously entered the hall against the stream of panicked workers and quickly realized they were all running for the door. She tried to talk to some of them to find out what was happening, but to no avail. The women were frantic, and all she could understand from their incoherent screams was something about a monster. She peeked down the long manufacturing hall, but she couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, or nothing that could possibly scare them like that. There was something else she noticed that terrified her in a whole nother way. The women running for the exit were in their panic, leaving the machines on and running. Well, this could spell a huge disaster, as the bullets in the machines were starting to pile up. Her sense of responsibility kicked in, and she quickly sprang into action. She ran to the first row of machines and started turning them off one by one. When she was done with one row, she quickly moved to the next one, and by now, all the women had escaped, and soon Maria, making her way through the rows of machines, was the only one left in the entire hall, or so she thought. Focused on her task, she rushed around the corner of another row of machines when she instantly froze in her tracks. She found herself face to face with the Thing. The Thing, or Chudo, meaning the weird thing, is how my grandmother referred to it. Well, what did it look like? I asked her. She described it as follows. It was short. It was a meter, a bit over 3 feet tall, with a big hairless head. It was slender and smooth and dark. In my grandmother's words, it was like frog-like skin. It had long and skinny fingers, and its face was dominated by large, pure black eyes, pretty much no nose, and a tiny, slit-like lipless mouth. There was no hair at all. There were no ears as far as she could see. It sported some kind of sheet draped over its torso, and it was slowly shuffling forward while mumbling something, but there were no recognizable words, and it didn't even sound like a language. Well, what about its head? What was it shaped like? I asked. She thought about it for a moment, and searching for the right words to describe it, and then she said it looked like an egg. I have to admit that when she said that, I was immediately disappointed. In my 9-year-old mind, this creature could not have been an alien, because I knew exactly what an alien's head was shaped like, because I had seen it in the movie E.T. What she described did not have a head like E.T. Back then, I never heard of a so-called gray alien. The only alien I knew of was E.T. Even any aliens I've seen in cartoons were different looking, as those were usually green and they had antennas on their heads. So just to confirm what she had said, I brought a pen and paper and I had my grandmother draw the head. Well, what she drew was the shape that I would later in my life see on the drawings of gray aliens. A head very round on the top and pointy on the bottom. Even though I had to work through the disappointment of it not being the E.T. from the movie, I was still eager to hear the rest of her story. So there she was, face to face with this thing, frozen in fear as they stared at each other for a moment, which felt to her like an eternity, and then finally the panic hit her and she took off running. If I recall correctly, she still had enough composure to turn off the last few machines before running for the door, not daring to look back. She was relieved to safely make it outside where the crowd of terrified employees had now gathered. Someone had already notified the German guards, who rushed over to investigate. and the slowly moving creature eventually made its way to the door, and it walked out where the curious crowd observed it from a safe distance. One of the last details I remember my grandmother telling me about this encounter was how one of the German guards was joking that they wanted to know if it was a male or a female, and he used his bayonet to lift up the sheet that the creature was wearing. Well, his joke made otherwise terrified women giggle a bit, but the findings of this odd gender reveal were unknown and were most likely inconclusive. The Germans then captured it. It was easy and without any resistance, and they loaded it on a truck and took it away. I asked my grandmother if she knew what happened to it afterwards. They told us they killed it, she answered, and that was that. With so much killing going on by the Nazis, absolutely no one questioned it. Personally, I highly doubt the Germans would kill it. They probably just said that to give the people some closure. There are some theories out there about Nazis collaborating with aliens during World War II. Could this be somehow part of it? Either way, such a creature would be way too valuable just to kill. Where it came from and how it got inside the underground factory hall will forever be one of the mysteries. There were air shafts up to the ceiling, and I remember my grandmother believing that it came through there, and what this creature was or what really happened to it afterwards also remains a big unknown. The whole thing was quite quickly put out of the people's minds simply because there was so much happening at these difficult times. For example, a couple of months later, the Allied forces made an air raid attempt at this Nazi-held weapon factory, but the bombs missed its target, and instead of the factory, they dropped near the village where my grandmother and her family lived. A local school full of kids was hit, but luckily the bomb just fell through the roof and did not explode. It was considered by locals a miracle. And so the war went on, and the weird creature encounter quickly became just one of the crazy things that happened during those horrible times of war. But sadly, my dear grandmother passed away in the late 1980s, just a couple of years after telling me this story, and I never got to talk to her about it again. I wish I could turn back time and sit down with her again. I would have so many more questions. But when you're a kid, you don't realize how precious and limited the time with your loved ones may be. And now I regret not having more conversations with her about her story and her life. So to all of you listening right now, I say, if you're lucky enough to still have your grandparents and elders around, take a moment to sit down with them and listen to their stories. You might just learn something incredible about their life. Oh, and before I forget, in any case any of you pondered about what you would do if you were working at a Nazi-occupied bullet factory during World War II, well, I'm happy to tell you that my grandmother Maria and her co-workers had conspired against the Nazis and were purposely putting too little gunpowder in the bullets. I like to think about all the lives that they may have saved by doing this. When the Nazis finally found out that there was something wrong with the bullets, they called my grandmother into the office for questioning. She thought she wasn't going to get out of there alive, but somehow she managed and they let her walk out of there. If my calculations are correct, at that time, she was already visibly pregnant with her first child, so maybe that helped. She immediately went into hiding and didn't go back to work anymore, knowing they were getting close to finding out the truth. And luckily for her and her co-conspirators, the war was coming to an end, and the Nazis just didn't have any more time to go after them. They were too busy losing the war and fleeing the Russian army that was closing in on them. Had they found out about it earlier, though, I most likely would have never been born. And she signs the email Mariana. She says you can use my name, and then there's a postscript. Feel free to contact me if you need help with some of the pronunciations. I know the town's name is a tough one, and I couldn't figure out a good way to phonetically transcript that for you. I think it's important to say the town's name, though, as it's a real place and a true story, however weird it sounds. And by the way, I really like when you sound your opinion on the stories that you read, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you think about this one. Thank you for your awesome podcast. Okay, first, this is one of the best stories that I think I've ever done. I get to go on other people's podcasts. I don't really like going on them because I don't have much to say. I'm not a very interesting person. And I don't know why people invite me on their podcast. I think some of them think that my channel has 175, 180,000 subscribers. So, in the storytelling world, it's probably a medium-sized channel. And they think that if they have me on, people will flock in and it will build their channel up, but it never does. It doesn't. Those kind of things really don't help. I go on these podcasts, and the question I always get, what's your favorite story? What is your favorite story that you've ever done? And my answer is, good grief, I've done so many, it's hard to pick any of them. But I'll remember this one, Mariana's story about town in Czechoslovakia. We have troubles even saying the name of the country, and it's said all the time around here. But anyway, so much history, and Anyway, I sent her an email saying, this is so good. I want you to know I'm going to put it in a podcast. And she wrote me back, and I want y'all to know that Mariana, this is English is her fourth or fifth language. She probably speaks her native language plus several other European languages, French, German, I don't know what else. And she lives in the United States now, so she had to learn English as a language. And people who can speak so many different languages, they have a knack for it. And I'm leading all up to this. For English to be her fourth or fifth language down that she's learned, and what that usually means is that's the fifth language she's learned. She did a remarkable job writing this. I see a few things in the letter. I did not edit this. I didn't do anything with this letter, but I see a few things in this where grammar is used differently in other languages. But I did not edit this one bit. I read it word for word from start to finish, and I just thought this was a great story. So it was very interesting. I'm glad, Mariana, you got to hear those stories and be that close to your grandmother. And what a interesting history your family has had. And I hope you're enjoying it here in the United States. We're glad to have people here that you guys are heroes. I mean, you guys went through, that Nazi occupation, and the Russians. People think that the United States won the Second War. We would have never won it without the Russians. The Russians did most of the heavy lifting, and they took most of the casualties. I don't know that the Russians would have won it without us. We kept the Nazis occupied for a long time with our invasion of Europe, but the Russians were, once they got a foothold and started pushing the Germans back out of Russia, they never did quit until they got to Berlin. And Russia liberated Czechoslovakia and her towns, and I know they appreciate what they did. So I'm just rambling on. I just thought this was a really great story, and I wanted to share it with you. I think this story happens in Alabama. Let's see what the man says. My name is Bo, and I have two short stories that are true. I'm not a writer, so feel free to rewrite them as needed. Bo, I'm not rewriting a word, man. This is pretty good. I'm going to read it just like it shows here. My mic's about to fall off. Let me tighten this thing up. All right, now it's in there. Story number one. Several years back, I was a member of a motorcycle club. I was on the way to a cookout being thrown by one of the chapters in a neighboring state 3 hours from my home. I was riding solo through somewhere near Tifton, Georgia, and I passed an old well-kept farmhouse. Beside the farmhouse was a shed and an empty lot. And at first glance, I thought I saw an 8-foot-tall grizzly bear statue made from wood. You know, the ones you would expect to see outside a fancy ski lodge or something like that. But then I noticed it wasn't a bear. It was a Bigfoot. Keep in mind, I'm still thinking statue or yard art. Anyhow, I go to the cookout, And as would be expected with bikers, alcohol was involved, and I ended up sleeping in a recliner. The next morning, I headed home, and I thought to myself, I'm going to stop and check out that Bigfoot statue. I remembered the approximate area and the road it was on, so I kept an eye closely on my route. When I got to what I was sure was the house, there was no statue. Did I see a Bigfoot? Did someone move the statue overnight? Those two questions will always linger in my head. Story number 2. I grew up in southeast Alabama, but I moved to South Carolina at the age of 41 just to try somewhere new and to start over. Soon after moving to South Carolina, I discovered the Congaree National Park. If you didn't know, the Congaree is a mix of old-growth pine forest and cypress swamps. So I did a little Google searching, and I read a story about in the 70s where a kid was temporarily kidnapped by a juvenile Bigfoot. The two ended up playing hide and seek until Mama Bigfoot said it was time to go home, and she pointed the human child in the direction of safety. Google it if you'd like to read the actual story. Well, my story took place on December 24, 2022. It was a Christmas Eve, and I hadn't been living in South Carolina very long, so I didn't know many people. I decided to camp out for Christmas, and the Bluff campground was completely empty for the holiday. It was just me and my Chihuahua, Scrappy. Sometime in the night, I started hearing coyotes in the distance. I didn't think it was a big deal. I grew up in Alabama, and I've seen and heard coyotes all my life. But then they kept getting closer, and I knew that they were on the hunt because they were yapping and yapping like crazy. I unzipped my tent to shine the flashlight, and before I could stop him, Scrappy shot out of the tent. I shined the flashlight to locate him, and I saw the eye shine of the whole pack of coyotes 100 yards away, and my dumbass 6-pound Chihuahua running right at them. I'm still scrambling to try to get out of the tent to catch Scrappy, and I hear this god-awful scream, howl, growl come from somewhere in the woods to my right. Well, I froze, and Scrappy froze, and best of all, the coyotes went from yipping and yapping to yelping and running the opposite direction. I got a hold of my dog, and I hid in my tent the rest of the night. I knew my truck was a mile hike in the dark away. I did hear something moving in the woods that night. It sounded like it was making wide circles around the entire campsite. Once again, was that a Bigfoot? I think it was, and he or she was looking out for me and my dog Scrappy. I have more stories about the sets of eyes in the dark, but I need to talk to my friend who was with me at the time to ask what he remembered seeing. Thanks for the great stories, you rock. And then he signs off Steve Lilly for president. Hell yes, Steve Lilly for president. That's who we need. Bo, thank you for this story. This was awesome. I'd like to talk to you about MC life. I need to do some research for Hook Johnson in my Steve Lilly series. I might email you back, or maybe Bo, you could email me and give me your phone number or something, and I'll give you a call. I have some questions about that. There's another guy I talked to who was actually a Hell's Angel. I think he lives in Virginia now. He's older, and he's not active in the club anymore, but he gave me a little information. One thing he told me, he said, if you write in Hook as a MC member, which he is, don't copy the name of any MC club in this whole country. Well, I don't know all the names of the motorcycle clubs in the country, so what if I get it wrong? But I had no intent of saying that he was a member of the Hells Angels chapter or Mongols chapter or Outlaws chapter in Memphis, and I had no intention of doing that. But what if I just get it wrong? Maybe I just won't even give the name of the MC club that he's in. But anyway, Bo, if you get a chance, shoot me an email, assuming you hear this. Thank you for the story. This was great. I appreciate you, buddy. This person doesn't give me permission to use your name, but I'm going to read her story. I recently discovered your channel, and I enjoy listening late at night. I just turned 50. I'm a woman, and I enjoy hunting and fishing and camping and hiking. My uncle, who lives in Washington State, is an avid hunter and has had a few Bigfoot encounters. I enjoy listening to other encounters. I have never seen one, and I honestly hope I never do. And I don't know if I'd be excited for hunting season anymore after I did. And I couldn't imagine not spending time in the woods. And as I was listening to one of your best of 6 episodes tonight, one story caught my attention. A woman driving to see a friend, and she saw a little person. I too have seen one. It was 30 years ago. No one has ever taken me serious when I tell them about it. I really don't care. I know what I saw. I was living in a rural area 20 miles from Athens, Georgia, with my husband at the time and his 10-year-old daughter. My brother, who was 16 years old, also lived with us. We lived in a small trailer park consisting of 4 other trailers, and the neighbors next to us had gotten this dog. I felt terrible for that dog. They didn't even take care of their kids very well, much less the dog. The dog was a full-grown chow, and they chained that poor thing to the outside post of their porch. There was no doghouse. There was no shade. They only had it for a few days when it snapped the chain and it ran around the area loose. They tried to catch it, but they never had any luck. But after a week, I would set out food for him and slowly coach the dog to trust me. I would come home from work and he'd be sitting on my back steps waiting for me. The neighbors one day noticed me sitting on my steps petting the dog, and the dad walked over with a leash. He asked me to put it on the dog, and I said, "No, you put it on." As he took a step closer to the dog growled and bared its teeth at the guy. The guy was scared and he jumped back and he said, "Well, I guess you can have him." I named him Mufasa after the Lion King. Mufasa loved me, but he didn't care for anyone else. Around this time, we were in the process of moving to a bigger house way out in the country. We didn't have neighbors for miles. Next to a cow pasture on one side, there were woods on the other. My husband at the time wouldn't let me keep Mufasa in the house full time. Mufasa scared him because he'd growl at him sometimes. He built him a nice big enclosure with a big dog house. And when I wasn't at work, though, that dog was always by my side. I'd bring him in the house and I'd bathe him in our garden tub and he'd hang out until bedtime. Mufasa was okay with everyone as long as I was there, but he followed me into every room and he didn't want anyone else touching him. One night everyone was sitting in the living room and would laugh because every time I'd get up, Mufasa would follow me. From the living room, you could walk into the dining room, which went into the kitchen, and from there you could walk into the den area and back into the living room. It made a big circle, so I got up and walked around the circle a few times, and everyone was having a laugh because Mufasa was following me. Shortly after sitting back down, I was facing the den when I clearly saw a figure dart across the den into the kitchen. I gasped, and I asked everyone else if they had seen it. Well, everyone said they had seen something move, but they weren't looking directly at it. I jumped up to go see what it was. Mufasa had seen it too, and he was scared. He wouldn't go into the den or the kitchen. He wouldn't move from his spot, and he was distressed, and he whined loudly and whimpered when I got up to investigate. Well, after looking around, I didn't find anything, but I know what I saw. It was 7 inches tall. It was a little man. It had on clothes and a hat, and honestly, it looked similar to a garden gnome figurine. I've had hamsters and pet rats as a teenager, but it wasn't an animal. It was a little person. Mufasa's reaction confirmed that to me. He chases raccoons and possums, and once he even got into a cow pasture and chased a cow until the bull chased him back. He wasn't scared of anything, but that dog was terrified. He never again would go into that den or kitchen, and I never saw it again, and neither did anyone else. The strangest thing I've ever seen. I never heard anyone else ever talk about something like this until I heard it on your channel tonight. Thank you, and she signs her name. Well, that's interesting. I don't get many little people stories, but they are quite intriguing. I would say that. I wonder what they are. I don't know. Anybody have any comments on that? Feel free to leave a comment. All right, here's an email from a gentleman who does not give me his name, and that's just dandy. Here's what he writes. On December 16 of 2020, I was 30 foot up a pine tree hunting slap dab in the middle of Leaf River WMA, and it was the second day of dog hunting season, and I'm not a dog hunter. I'm a steel hunter, so you have to go to the WMA unless you have a private land or private lease. But that year, I was not in a lease. I was using public land to hunt so that I was basically getting away from the dog hunters. When I say dog hunters, I'm talking about people who drive dogs to kill deer. I've done it before when I was younger. I was not a huge fan of it, but each to his own. I'll stop right here and say I can't stand that. I guess it's fun for some people, but I don't get the sport in it. I've also done it when I was a kid. My father did it. My uncles did it. And even back then when I was 10 or 11 years old, I thought it was kind of stupid to spend all that money on dogs when you can just put up a stand and wait for a deer to walk by and kill it. I don't get the terrorizing the deer with the dogs. I don't have anything against killing deer. I kill 2 or 3 every year. But running them with dogs makes no sense to me. Probably made a few enemies with that statement, but I agree with this man. Back to the story. I was hunting a power line adjacent to a huge ryegrass field. We're talking 200 yards wide and about 1,000 yards long, and are used to set up and hunt behind it before this encounter. I don't think I believe in Bigfoot. It definitely was not on my mind. Or maybe if I thought something like that could exist to be a problem in the Northwest Canada or Northwest, I do remember seeing the Patterson-Gimlin film when I was a young boy, like in the early 80s, and they would show it on late night shows and stuff like that. It was kind of like a freak show. My mother and dad always said that it wasn't real. It was somebody in a suit, something like that. Well, my encounter was very long, probably best of 20 to 25 minutes before this thing finally took off, but I got to see everything. And when I first saw him, he was 150 yards to the north side of the power line. And when he finally spotted me, he walked straight to me 30 yards away. These things are not what people think they are. It's a type of people. These things have emotions. You can see it on their face. It did a lot of human-looking stuff, but it wasn't a human. If that makes sense, I would love to talk to you about it one day. I'm not very good at writing and stuff like that, but I'm better at word of mouth, so if you'd like to contact me, and he gives me his phone number. I live in D'Iberville, Mississippi, and I'm probably 1.5 miles from the Gulf Coast, but where I was hunting was 2 counties up in Perry County, Mississippi, where this happened, and I had something else happen to me this year. No visual this time, just got a few tree knocks and whistles. Thank you very much, Cam, kindest regards. And right there, he does give me his name, and I'm not going to say it because he doesn't say I can use it. But you can tell I didn't edit this. It's a little bit confusing, and I understand some people are better at talking about it than writing about it. But still, you got the information. I thought it was a good story. He got to see this thing for 20 to 25 minutes, and he believes that they act human, but they're not human. Got to see facial expressions, all kind of stuff. This is a rare sighting. A lot of people don't get to see this kind of stuff, but he says he'd like to talk to me about it. If I can get the time to do some more interviews, I might give this guy a call. But I appreciate the email. It was a great story. Thank you very much. This gentleman wants to be anonymous, and of course that's no problem. He writes, I want to apologize in advance if this story isn't very clear. The signs of an encounter didn't register to me at first. The realization only hit me recently. I'm now 28 years old, but in the summer of 2006, when I was 15, it was the age when this encounter took place. I lived in Yazoo County, Mississippi my entire life. I grew up hunting and fishing and exploring the woods on my parents' property and the neighboring land owned by family friends. My buddy and I had come across what I now recall as tree structures, some built like 4-post teepees while others had an A-frame design. It was an odd thing to see in the middle of the woods. On the day of the encounter, we had spent the morning fishing at his grandfather's place. The fish weren't biting, so we ditched the idea and decided to walk down to a creek just to see how far it went. When we were 2 miles into our walk, we came across a small waterfall that had an opening to a cove where we could see a sparse bed of leaves and pine straw. We took a minute to catch our breath and then continued down the creek, and after a mile, we stopped on a ridge just to enjoy the scenery. I don't know why I noticed this, but at that particular moment, the woods seemed to go completely silent, like the good Lord had hit the mute button. Seconds later, we heard a gunshot 300 yards away, and it was followed by a scream that sounded like a man, but with much more power and volume than I'd ever heard outside of a rock singer, bellowing through a wall of loudspeakers. Tree branches cracked as if a bulldozer was rolling through the woods at full speed. Our instinct was to run all the way back to my buddy's grandmother's place like the two frightened teenagers we were. These days, I like to watch the sun go down over the woods from my back porch and wonder just what goes on out there while I'm asleep in bed. And that's the end of the story, so I don't know what to say about that story. Man, that's pretty cool. They heard a shot and something screamed and came running through the woods like a bulldozer. What could that have been in Yazoo County, Mississippi? There are bears down there. Maybe it could have been a bear. I don't know, though. I don't know that a bear would scream that loud. You will have to decide what you think this guy encountered. Thank you for the story, Mr. Anonymous. I really appreciate it. All right, I think that's going to wind it up. Thank you all for joining me on this podcast. My podcasts have been kind of further apart than they have been historically over the last 5 years. I know that. I've explained that in the last 2 or 3 podcasts. I'm not going to talk about it again. So the people who are hanging with me, man, I love you. I appreciate you. Anytime that I have away from this desk, I spend outside doing work in my yard and stuff that I've neglected over the last 5 years, spending time with my family. So I appreciate you. I know you understand that. Most people that are listening go, heck, that's exactly what I would do. But then there's some people who are mad. I got an email from a lady saying she was unsubscribing and she is tired of my excuses and she's leaving the farm. And I thought, damn lady, I don't work for you. I'm not your employee. I can do whatever I want to do with this podcast. This thing will get back on track when the weather turns, and I don't know. It'll probably take a little while, but I just want to let you know thank you and let you know that I appreciate you hanging with me. I ain't going nowhere. I've been doing this for 5 years. I'm working on audiobooks for the podcast, not for Audible. I'm working on audiobooks for the podcast. I got all kind of stuff planned. Just taking a little time to spend outside. I'd rather be outside than sitting behind this desk. Now, that's a fact. All right. I know the lady who unsubscribed is going, I don't have more excuses. But it's not. I'm just telling you what I'm doing. So you can get glad in the same shoes you got mad in, lady. All right. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you on the next one. And I'll have another one up this week. Love you all. See you soon.